Recently, I've covered some pretty serious topics here on the channel, and so I thought today we would lighten things up. Let's have a bit of fun while still showing some of the more problematic and ridiculous parts of the Bible, and even calling into question the very nature and character of both Yahweh and Jesus, as well as some of the other leading men of the scriptures here. We're going to do that by way of looking at the compliments that are given in the Bible, something I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about. There's more than you think, and they really don't work out very well. You'll see what I mean as we start going through these examples. And I think to start, tomorrow is President's Day. Let's do one that is very Trumpish in nature. Numbers 12:3 says that Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Now, many of us know that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch. Obviously, it includes details about his very death, and we also know that this character probably most likely did not exist in history, but the Christian traditional view of authorship is that Moses penned the book of Numbers, which means, according to their own ideas, Moses himself would have immediately disqualified himself from this claim simply by making it. Just a fun one to kick things off, but let's move on. What did God have to say about a few people? How about Job? Well, in Job 1:1, it says, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man named Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil." What a guy. The first guy to be called essentially perfect is what some versions say in the entire Bible. A direct contradiction to later when it is said that no one is righteous, no one is perfect. But Job was, and what a compliment that was, and yet what did God do to him? He allowed the adversary to completely destroy his life. He tempted him to sin by rejecting God, which also God is said not to do in his immutable character and nature. And maybe you think the story has a happy ending because God rewards Job, and if that's your sense of justice, you can keep it. But again, an amazing compliment from the God of all creation. And yet he thought so little of Job that he was willing to have his children murdered, all his things taken and destroyed, and his physical body tortured, all while being rejected by his friends and wife. Cool. Next we have Jephthah, who in Judges 11:1 is complimented as a mighty warrior. Now, what do you think of when you hear the term mighty warrior? Probably someone that through skill or leadership is able to defeat the enemy. Is that how Jephthah did it though? No, he made a deal with God to sacrifice the first thing he sees upon his arrival home if God gives them the victory. Now, of course, God being a perfect God says, I don't want that. I would never want you to sacrifice something. I want to help you because you're my chosen people. Nope, that's not what he said. He said, bet, to which he delivered Jephthah the victory, knowing with his perfect foreknowledge who the first person Jephthah would see would be, which was his daughter. And so Jephthah sacrifices, human sacrifice, his daughter to uphold his end of the bargain to appease this God for a military victory. What a mighty warrior. 2 Peter 2:7, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. I wonder if Lot was as distressed by the depraved conduct of his daughters, who would later rape him, one of which producing Moab, which would be where Ruth comes from, which is the great-grandmother of David, thus begetting the line of Jesus. That's a fun little connection. But more importantly, when the angels were about to be gang raped by the awful wicked men of Sodom, what was righteous Lot's solution? Was it to pray to God for help? Was it to offer himself instead? No, it was to offer his virgin daughters. Good old righteous Lot. Starts making you think about that incident in the cave might have just been revenge on their part, but I digress. Also in Old and New Testament, Abraham is called a friend of God, a very personal thing. Again, the creator of the entire universe, of all people on the planet, even though we never hear about any of the others, Abraham is the friend of God. You know what they say about the company you keep says a lot about you. And what do we know about Abraham? We know that he owned slaves. We know that he raped one of his slaves, Hagar. And we also know that he was willing to kill his son just because he thought it's what his God wanted him to do. What a friend. Maybe that's what it takes to be God's friend. He needs to know, and this is literally what the story says, that you are willing, it is a test, to kill your own children for him. Yep. That gets you the seal of approval from this perfect God of love, peace, and justice. To start here, we're hitting with some of the major ones, and I have a few more of those, but then I have some I bet you haven't even thought of before. But still, let's cover one that everyone knows, good old King David. And what was his big compliment? Well, both Old and New Testament will say that David was a man after God's own heart. I can't imagine a more beautiful compliment coming from the creator of the universe. Reading from the New Testament, Acts 13:22, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. And as you know, some of those things include having an affair, being a polygamist, killing an innocent man to cover up the affair, mutilating 200 of his enemies to get foreskins to get another wife, genocide in general. Take your pick, and the list still goes on from there. That is a man after God's own heart who will do everything God wants him to do. Thank not God, my heart is not one after Yahweh's. But the compliments don't stop there in the family tree. His son Solomon gets a really amazing compliment as well. God, speaking to Solomon, 1 Kings 3:12, I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. So literally, the wisest, most discerning man that had ever been and ever could be. Good thing the Christians added in the hypostatic union so that Jesus wasn't just 100% man, he also got to be 100% God. Otherwise, Solomon would be wiser than Jesus. But do we see proof of that? I mean, I know we have the amazing story about Solomon saying that the baby should be chopped in half to find out who the real mother is, and yeah, that's pretty brilliant, but isn't Solomon also the same person who had 700 wives and 300 concubines that allowed him to be pulled away from God because of their pagan influences? That doesn't sound very discerning. Didn't he build a temple for a foreign god? Didn't he use slave labor to build the temple for Yahweh? And again, according to biblical authorship tradition, he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes that just says everything is meaningless. Is that the greatest wisdom? Is that what this God thinks? Oh, you know who we skipped when we were talking about people that were righteous and blameless? Noah. I said Job was the first man to be called that. That's chronologically, although that may not even be accurate. But Genesis, which is supposedly the start of all of this, Genesis 6:9 says, this is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Again, remember, no one is considered righteous except supposedly Job and Noah. We'll see if we get to any more. And this is the blameless man that after God saved just his entire family from being wiped out by the greatest genocide of all time, he gets immediately drunk, exposes himself to his son, which somehow leads to his son's lineage being cursed for all time, which was used as a great justification for slavery. By the way, I know some of these, for some of you that are unfamiliar, will need unpacking. That's not what this video is for, but we can handle these one by one, and I've mentioned a lot of them in previous videos. Let's jump around. Let's go up to the New Testament, though. And what did Jesus say to Peter that was such a great compliment? Matthew 16:18, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gate of Hades will not overcome it. Wow, what power, what authority, what purpose, what confusion. Just a few verses later in Matthew 16:23, Jesus calls him Satan himself, just for being concerned, by the way. And then what does Peter do shortly thereafter? Denies him 3 times. Yes, he repents and gets forgiveness and goes on, making amazing decisions for the rest of the apostles. I'll cover one of those here at the very end. But this is the rock, the apostle who denied him most, that he also has to call Satan. It's just hilarious. Now, this next one you could say is maybe hyperbole and doesn't really matter, but I think there's a couple parts to it that are interesting or funny. So the Israelites themselves as a people group sometimes get compliments and sometimes get the worst of God's insults. In Genesis 22:17, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars. I would take that as a compliment from Yahweh. It's a blessing. Later, he kind of also gives them more security with this. Even if you were exiled people to the farthest horizon, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. Well, that just didn't happen. They were exiled. They were captured. They were dispersed, and they did not all make it back, and they are nowhere near as numerous as the stars. They're not even more numerous than any other people group on Earth. In fact, even to this day, remaining is impressive, but there's only 15 million of them. And I bet if you told that number, 15 million, to the people back then, they would have been like, that's definitely more than the stars we see in the sky, because they didn't know anything. But this God would have. Interesting. Well, we're kind of around this abstract one. Let me give you another one. The law of the Lord is perfect, says Psalm 19:7. The very same law that includes slavery, that includes genocide, that includes permission for women to be raped and sold as slaves, that permits the killing of children for being disobedient, and a ton of other ridiculous, non-perfect things, while leaving out a ton of things that would have made it perfect. So we covered God's people and we covered God's law, both with big promises, big compliments that completely fail. And I know we're jumping around, forgive me here. The next one I want to cover is John the Baptist. I wonder if you know what was said about him. Let me read it for you. in Matthew 11:11, "Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist." The very next line, though, makes this sound pretty backhanded. "Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." I'll let that marinate for you, but let's just talk about John the Baptist in general and how brilliant and great he was. He didn't perform miracles like the other prophets did or the apostles that would follow Jesus did. John didn't bring the greatest teaching. What teachings of John the Baptist do Christians hold on to today? Just compare that with even someone like James or Peter or Paul, who is pretty much where we have most of Christianity from. But the biggest reason to not think that John is definitely the greatest is his confusion and doubt in Jesus Christ himself. Wasn't it John who baptized Jesus? Didn't he see the dove descend on Jesus? Didn't he hear the booming echoes of Yahweh rumbling through the sky that this is my son with whom I am well pleased? But do you know what John said after that while he was in prison? It's in Matthew 11:23. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" This brilliant man who had been set aside from the beginning of his life to prepare a way didn't even know for sure. Again, these compliments are just so funny to me. Now here's a for sure compliment, and I just want to do some comparing with it. This is about King Saul. Now, God loved Saul. God was a big fan of Saul. That wasn't until Saul didn't complete his genocide. He killed all the women and children God wanted him to kill. He killed all the soldiers. He killed most of the animals. He just left alive the king and some animals to sacrifice to God. And that is when God said, "Nope, I'm done with Saul. It's time to go get me someone else." But what did God like about Saul, or what was the compliment God gave? It was this. 1 Samuel 9:2, Kish had a son named Saul, a handsome and young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. So tall, dark, and handsome Saul here is who God chose to be the leader of his army. God had great purpose for this man, but when this man wouldn't do the full genocide, what did he say? "I'll find someone who will." And he sends Samuel out to the house of Jesse to pick from his sons, where we get David, who is specifically chosen despite his attributes. Now, you could say that's a good story. Yeah, it should be about what's in the heart. But if we rewind back to when we covered David, the man after God's own heart, you know what David did that Saul didn't, that made David worthy when Saul wasn't? David was the one who could complete the genocides. David was the military leader that Yahweh wanted, because that was what was in Yahweh's heart. I just think it's amazing to see all the pieces come together. I won't read the whole thing to you, but we often hear of the ideal woman or wife, the Proverbs 31 woman. You know, the one that sets about her work vigorously, whose arms are strong for their tasks. While what does her husband do? Sit at the city gate, by the way. The idealized version of a woman, the complement of the godly, righteous woman or wife as laid out in this book of wisdom by, again, that man who had 700 of these strong working wives, is essentially that she works from sunrise to sunset, that she runs the business, that she makes the clothes, that she cooks and cleans and takes care of the children, while her husband hangs out with the elders in a position of respect, essentially doing nothing. Thanks, God, for what an amazing blessing it is to be one of these great women and wives. I'm sure they're very appreciative. Moving on, I think this one's interesting. In Daniel 2:37, "Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory." This is from Daniel, who spoke for God, to King Nebuchadnezzar, the King of Kings, who Yahweh has given dominion, power, and glory to. It's interesting that God gave this kind of blessing, compliment, power, whatever you want to call it, to a foreign pagan king. But if we read the rest of our Old Testament, we know why. He wanted to punish Israel. He wanted to hurt them so that they would come crawling back. Literally, you can go and read the Bible for yourself. And when he is done using these people like Nebuchadnezzar, he will destroy them and their countries for their evil in doing these things. The very things he raised them up to do, a bunch of collateral damage. And specifically, how does he do this to Nebuchadnezzar? He makes him go insane and eat grass like a cow for years. But let's get back to the New Testament. There's some compliments from Jesus that are ridiculous, especially when we talk about how great and loving and merciful this great Son of God was. And of course, one of my favorite examples of that is Jesus' interaction with the Canaanite woman. Now, you probably know the story because I've talked about it a lot, but she's begging Jesus for a healing. He says no. She begs some more. He laughs at her. He insults her. He calls her a dog. This is not the compliment. He says, I'm not here for you. I'm here for the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel. And only because she's so clever and has the faith that he can do these things, she makes the retort where she has to lower herself and say, yes, I know, but don't even dogs get scraps from the table? This pleases Jesus. Then she gets her compliment. You have great faith. And so he goes ahead with the healing. And the sickest part of this is that Christians relish in this story. Look at Jesus rewarding this woman. They use her as some example. We should all have the faith of that woman. You mean the desperation to put yourself down of what if you believe the whole Bible, Jesus would have been the same entity that created her, to have to humiliate herself in front of her maker just to get a scrap of his power that cost him nothing, so that he could use her for his glory after insulting her and telling everyone what no one clearly wants to know, which is that Jesus was not here for the whole world. His mission was for his chosen people. It's amazing how these things get digested differently. I had a few other humble brags in here. In fact, I have kind of a whole list of Paul, but I realized I did a similar video on Paul, so I won't do the compliments of Paul to himself. Let's move on to just two last ones. We'll do another Old Testament, another New Testament. In the Old Testament, Judges 6:12, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Again, getting called mighty warrior, just like Jephthah. What a compliment. Can you imagine an angel of God coming down to you, a commander of God's army, and saying, you are a mighty warrior? But he wasn't. He was a coward, a man who would literally go and hide in a wine press, shirking off his responsibility and duty because he didn't have enough faith that his God could deliver a victory. And the last one, and the reason I put this one at the end is because I know I've lost many of you along the way, and those of you who are here won't care at this point if I make a second video, because I want to talk all about this as its own video at some point. And this is a compliment that Jesus gives to his 12 followers. And yet there is a major issue here. Matthew 19:28. Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, okay, this is not hyperbole, this is not a parable, this is matter-of-fact speech from Jesus. At the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones. So there will be 12. He's addressing his 12, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Do you know who was standing there as one of the 12? Judas. And Judas got this compliment, one of the greatest compliments you could get. The Son of God has chosen you specifically to reign in heaven. But Judas betrayed Jesus and then killed himself. We don't know how, because there's two different contradictory claims about his death, and not just that, but also where he got the silver, what was done with the silver, etc. So even if you try to make the whole, oh, he was hanged and then fell and his belly and guts fell out, okay, that's literally one of the stupidest things I've ever heard, but you can have it. It still doesn't resolve the contradiction. After Judas's betrayal, does he go up and reign and judge others? That seems ridiculous, and some Christians would say yes. You know what? I don't want to get into the video where I cover too many of the objections, but one of the main objections is that, oh no, it'll be the new 12. Because later, we hear this in Acts, Peter, and remember I told you Peter would go on to make great leadership decisions. Peter references some obscure Old Testament law about needing to replace authority, and so he says we need a 12th follower. And they laid out some recommendations for where they should get this, and they ended up coming down to two people, Matthias and Justus, I believe, and they couldn't decide, so they prayed. Good, they sought God, but how did they let God speak? They cast lots. These men who had been following God in human form, who knew Jesus personally, were so unsure of how to hear from the Lord or from the Holy Spirit that he gave them that, yeah, they threw up a quick prayer and then they essentially rolled the dice to make the decision on who would be the 12th, which, again, according to this excuse, would be the one reigning in heaven, judging the tribes. Absolute insanity. Again, I want to do a whole video on it. So that's it. 20-some weird compliments in the Bible, mainly from God and Jesus, that are either ridiculous, incorrect, hypocritical, or showcase a very dark and twisted nature of this supposedly perfect God. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something new. Let me know if you have any other examples that I didn't include that you want to include in the comments, or any questions about the ones that we covered or additional information. I will see you Tuesday with a new video, and until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GVI, Joe, Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn; my Humanist heroes, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus; my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.